Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues and everyone present. Allow me to open the panel session for the defense of the thesis by Liudmila Dementyeva. The thesis is submitted in conformity with the requirements for the academic degree of the candidate of psychology. The specialization is 190004 medical psychology. The topic of the thesis is interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism, under the order issued by St. Petersburg State University as of May 17, 2019, number 5155/1. I, Olga Shelkova, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, Acting Head of the Department of Medical Psychology and Psychophysiology of St. Petersburg State University, have been appointed the chairperson of this dissertation board. And allow me to introduce my colleagues, the members of the board. Ludwig Wassermann, a Doctor of Medical Sciences, Professor of the Department of Medical Psychology and Psychophysiology of St. Petersburg State University. Then Svetlana Solovyova, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, and by the moment of the appointment of the board, Head of the Department of General Medical Psychology and Pedagogics of the Mechnikov Medical University. And remotely via Skype we have Elena Malkova, Doctor of Psychology, Professor of the Department of Clinical Psychology and Psychological Counseling of the Russian State Pedagogical University, titled after Herzen. And also Vanya Lukova Matanova-Koleva, Doctor of Psychology of St. Clement Orchidski Sofia University. First of all, I would like to note that under the federal law, as of August 23, 1996, number 127 FZ on Science and State Scientific and Technical Policy, St. Petersburg State University is entitled to confer academic degrees. The corresponding order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, based on which we are holding our session today, was issued September the 1st, 2016, and its number is 6821/1, and further on I'll refer to it as an order. According to the above-mentioned order, the session of the dissertation board is valid, providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present, but no less than 4 people. Our dissertation board consists of 5 people. Everyone is with us today remotely and here in the hall. Therefore, we have a quorum. And our session should not last more than 2 hours, and the agenda is as follows. First, the chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. The chairman's reply to the questions, if any, so 5 minutes for that. The candidate's presentation providing an overview and findings of the research, 15 minutes. Questions to the candidate regarding the presentation, no more than 2 minutes for each question, and candidates reply to the questions. Then the reports of on the thesis. The board members will be taking floor in turns to provide their reviews and questions, no more than 10 minutes each. Then the chairman's report on the thesis. Then the candidate comments about the reports on the thesis and replies to the questions, no more than 15 minutes for that. And this can be done after all the reports and after each of the report. Then the open discussion, and the floor will be given to the non-board members of the audience, and they can give a brief account of the ideas or ask questions or provide offers about their research, no more than 5 minutes per person. And at that, if you're willing to speak out, it is necessary to fill in the registration form. in the first row, and give your full name before the talk. Then we're going to have the candidates' replies to the questions, if any, no more than 5 minutes. For that, then the presentation of the candidate's thesis supervisor, 3 minutes. Then a 5-minute discussion before the open balloting on conferring or non-conferring the academic degree. And the discussion of the results of the defense is not broadcast. Then we're going to have an open balloting procedure, vote counting by the chairperson, and recording the results in the protocol of the session. Then making a decision on whether to confer or not to confer the academic degree of St. Petersburg State University, and finally candidate's closing speech. So before proceeding with the agenda, I would like to ask you to switch off your mobile phones. And the panel session of the dissertation board is being recorded and the broadcast on the St. Petersburg State University website, and it is also interpreted into English. So let me start with the first item of our agenda, the chairman's presentation, a short report. So, the thesis of Liudmila Dementyeva for the academic degree of the candidate of psychology, specialization 190004, medical psychology, is titled Interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism. The thesis was approved for the defense by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, issued on May 17, 2019, number 5154/1. The dissertation board was appointed by the order of the Academic Secretary as of May 17, 2019, number 5155/1. The candidate has submitted the following documents to the Academic Secretary. So they are submitted as in the paper form here, and if you're willing, you can get acquainted with them. So these documents are an application in the name of the rector, Professor Nikolai Kropachev, with a request to examine the thesis and accept it for the defense. It was submitted on April 8, 2019. The report of the supervisor, Sergei Nikolopov, candidate of psychology, head of the Department of Medical Psychology of the Scientific Center for Mental Health. The list of 6 published works which describe the research findings and 6 academic papers have been published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science. Then the letter of verification issued by Lomonosov Moscow State University as of June 15, 2011, number 1444, certifying that Ms. Dementyeva passed the candidacy exams under Specialization 190004, Medical Psychology. These exams include History and Science Philosophy for Psychology B mark, English A mark, and Medical Psychology B mark. Then the University Diploma with Honors, number VSA 0545-220, issued July 30, 2006 by Moscow State University, certifying that June 5, 2006, Ms. Dementyeva was awarded the qualification of psychologist, clinical psychology instructor. The thesis in Russian and English, a printed version with a manuscript copyright and in a digital copy. The thesis format complies with the GOST standard P7.0, and the dissertation is printed and the output data correspond with GOST P7.0.4. The above mentioned documents comply with item 12 of section 3 on the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, Annex 1 to the order. Questions on my report, if any? Okay, no questions. Therefore, please, Liudmila, you have the floor for your report on the thesis. So you have 15 minutes. Distinguished chairperson and members of the board, allow me to introduce my research. The relevance of research of interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism is explained by a lack of development of the problem and a lack of theoretical concept. And this term was introduced in 1864, and it denotes a relatively uniform delay in the rate of persons' both psychic and physical development. This term infantilism is widely used, and initially it was used to denote a person that retains childlike characteristics, and as of today it is considered as a developmental delay. Some authors believe that that's a temporary state, and others believe that it is the basis for the establishment of different psychopathology. And psychic infantilism is something that we mention within the framework of intellectual insufficiency, and it is also considered as a physical and socio-developmental problem. And psychic infantilism is a comprehensive phenomenon of medical knowledge, and it becomes the object of study not only in psychiatry but in clinical psychology. And we should note the social importance in pedagogics and defectology. And in practical works, the experts face certain difficulties when they train such adolescents, and this reduces the potential of their social adaptation. And in current work, we're going to talk about psychic infantilism as a violation of psychic development that has social factors of formation and that have an impact on the emotional, cognitive spheres of development, and that reduces the opportunity for social adaptation of adolescents. And the relevance of research outlined by 4 key aspects. Uncertain definitions, uncertain borders between norms and pathology, and nosological specificity and lack of systemic assessment, and in the interaction between emotions and intelligence outlines several relevant aspects. And here we see the correlation of emotional and cognitive factors, the establishment of this system of interaction between affect and intelligence, and their mutual dependence in different nosologies. And the present research we're going to talk about the norm characteristic development of the general intelligence and emotional intelligence as a general structure of intelligence, which is a substructure of the system of unity between affect and intelligence, and it should include general emotional intelligence and psychological self-regulation. And this unity can be represented as overlapping sets, where emotional intelligence is central, and it is bordered by general intelligence and psychological self-regulation on both sides. And in turn, the general intelligence and psychological self-regulation will be intrasystemic factors, while nosology and psychic infantilism non-systemic factors. And as clinical groups, we have chosen patients with organic non-psychotic disorders and also schizotypal disorder patients. And here we see the relevance between psychic infantilism and emotional intelligence. So the theoretical methodological basis is includes the theory of cultural and history development of psyche by Vygotsky, then Lebrinsky and Lichko concept of dysontogenesis, then theory of the unity of psyche, interdependence of motivational, demand, emotional and intellectual spheres by Mr. Ananyev, Zikarnik and others, and the concept of emotional intelligence by Murray, Salovey and Caruso. So the scientific novelty and theoretical importance are outlined by the fact that for the first time we've chosen polyparametric means of assessment of psychic infantilism, based on which we offered multidimensional criteria for the systematizing of psychic infantilism that open the opportunities to compare it with different nosologies. And for the first time we have an interaction between the intelligence and affect, and we've outlined the systemic interdependence in adolescent age depending on the intra and outer systemic factors. And as for the practical importance, it is outlined by the opportunity to use these results for the development of a differential approach to the infantilism problem, and that is needed to improve the efficiency of therapy, to outline the targets for rehabilitation work, and also to improve the social adaptation of adolescents with infantilism if they have organic or schizotypal disorders. The goal of the work is to establish the link between affect and intelligence, and the object of research is emotional, personal, sphere and structure of intelligence in adolescents with PI, and the subject, the interdependence of emotions and intelligence of organic non-psychotic disorder and schizotypal disorder patients with PI. And in current work we have three hypotheses for research. First, in the norm, the interdependence between emotions and intelligence can be seen as a system of unity between affect and intelligence, including three components: general emotional intelligence and psychological self-regulation. And emotional intelligence here is a system-forming factor. Second, there are qualitative and quantitative differences in the general intelligence structure depending on the nosology, background, and the factor of psychic infantilism. And third, PI has another specific structure that is represented by peculiarities of emotional, social, and personal self-regulation as the basic psychology regulation factors. And allow me not to read the goals of the research. They are given on the slide and on the distributed materials. And we have 245 adolescents aged 15-18. Some of them are school students and they have no psychological pathology, and we divided them into three groups according to intelligence level. 140 adolescents were in the experimental group that was divided into four subgroups in accordance with the nosology factor and factor of infantilism. And in our research we use the following methods and methodologies. To outline the group of adolescents in clinical groups, we use the method of expert assessments, background analysis, clinical psychological talk, and infantilism expressiveness questionnaire. And we also use the Wechsler test. To study the emotional intelligence, we used Meyer-Salovey-Caruso test. For the psychological self-regulation, we use the test of non-existent animal, Damper-Rubinstein and Cloudender tests. To describe the character of interdependence between emotional and general intelligence, we organize correlation analysis. To assess the differences, we've used Spearsman, Mano-Whitney, and Wilcoxon criteria. And here are the 5 provisions for the thesis. The interdependence of emotions and intelligence can be represented as the system of unity between affect and intelligence, including 3 components: general emotional intelligence and psychological self-regulation. General and emotional intelligence form as subsystems of the general structure, and emotional intelligence is the system-forming factor. And the ties between general and emotional intelligence inside this subsystem, they outline the general systemic factors. In pathology, there is no certain specific problems. In pathology, the interdependence between the general and emotional intelligence is something that will lack, and in the norm it is outlined by the level of general intelligence, and the qualitative differences in the general structure of intelligence depend on nosology, background, and for the group with schizotypic disorder, there are certain difficulties, and we should also consider the differences in organic disorders. Here we have negative correlations. Fourth, the group with organic non-psychotic disorders, the leading factor of psychic infantilism is infantilizing one, and it changes here the emotional intelligence dependent on the psychic infantilism, and in psychic group there's nosology factor. And fifth provision is that psychic infantilism has a nosodependent structure represented by peculiarities of self-regulation, and in organic group we have high self-regulation, and we should consider its social component, that it can be considered as hypercompensation mechanism. And in schizotypical disorder group there is a vice versa regularity, because there's the reduction of the indicators of psychological self-regulation compared with non-infantile adolescents. And as for the results, they are as follows. On this slide you see the diagram, and here we consider the Wechsler test and the general test, and here we see the unity between emotions and intelligence, and here you see the correlation. And in the subgroup of mid-norm 2 we have the balanced indicators, and it is approved by correlation ties here. And in N1 and N3 the general indicator of intelligence is higher than emotional intelligence with its branches, and the correlation between the general indications of general intelligence is something that we lack, and the number of correlations drops. On this slide you see the diagram that allows us to compare the results for Wechsler test and emotional intelligence test in general tests for norm and pathology. And while considering Wechsler test, the general intelligence indications in norm and in disorder, they are just balanced. And as for organic disorders, that's low norm. And if we consider the hierarchy of components of intelligence in norm and organic disorders, the indicators of verbal and non-verbal intelligence are a bit different, and the prevalence of non-verbal intelligence is observed, and there's a vice versa trend in another group. And considering the emotional intelligence, we've detected that patients in clinical groups have high indications of emotional intelligence than in the norm, and this reflects the compensation in adolescent age. And the express character for emotional intelligence in organic disorders and norm, they have the similar structure, while the hierarchy of components in schizotypal sphere demonstrates vice versa case. And if we can compare two tests, in the norm the general intelligence with all its components is higher than emotional intelligence, and this is characteristic for adolescent age. And in clinical groups we observe high variability and lack of coordination between the parameters of general and emotional intelligence, and here the leading component is the detection of emotions, and in schizotype, problem verbal intelligence. And on this slide you see the diagram that allows us to compare the results of Wechsler test and emotional intelligence tests in infantile and non-infantile types of adolescents with organic and non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorder. And within the framework of its nosology we don't see any differences. And as for the quantities, it depends on the norm of pathology. In organic disorders in infantile adolescents, the general and emotional intelligence is higher, and in schizotypal low. And the clinical analysis demonstrated that without infantilism the correlation times are smaller than in N1 and 3. So that is the norm groups that have border-like indications, and in infantile adolescents demonstrate the reduction of correlation types, and the organic disorder group demonstrate the vice versa correlation. The lower the verbal intelligence, the higher the emotional intelligence and its branches, emotion detection and understanding of emotion. And it demonstrates the qualitative differences in intelligence, and it's outlined that PI has another specific differences, and in organic disorders we have the compensation system for cognitive deficit, and in schizotypal we see the deterioration of defect, and thus we can outline the two factors of the formation of such disorders, a nosological one and infantilizing one, characteristic for organic disorders. And on this slide you see the table with the results of self-regulation tests. We've detected the peculiarities of psychological self-regulation, allowed us to add up the peculiarities of these groups, including the PI factor. And this table reflects characteristics of all four subgroups. Yet, let's dwell upon nosological differences in PI. In organic disorder group, we see a higher level of psychological self-regulation, and that is the role social component, and that is expressed in the orientation for approval and with the suppression of anxiety and the suppression of hostility. And in schizotypal disorder with PI we detect a lower level of psychological self-regulation that is pronounced in hostility, anxiety, impulsiveness, and less development of communication skills and a poorer orientation in social context. Distinguished members of the board, allow me not to read out all the conclusions of my report. They're given in the distributed materials, and allow me to shortly outline the basic results of the research and sum up my report. In our work, we were based on the system of correlation between emotions and intelligence, and these results are explained by heterochrony and asynchrony of development in the group of norm of organic and schizotypic disorders. In the norm, we defined a unity of general and emotional intelligence, and in clinical groups, we see a lack of development in the establishment of this unity, and in another group, we have a deviation. And we've also considered the change in the system or between emotions and intelligence depending on PI. In organic disorders, we've shown compensation in infantile adolescents that is reflected in correlation ties and the improvement of self-regulation, especially in communication. Whereas in schizotypal disorder, we see the deterioration of the effect due to PI. And thus, we can outline two factors for the formation of PI, nosological one and infantilizing one. Thank you very much, Liudmila. Is that all? Yes, thank you. Distinguished colleagues, questions to the candidate, if any, reflecting the basic provisions of the dissertation. Is anyone willing? Okay, then the members of the dissertation board. Yes? Okay. Then I have a question. The conclusion 7 of the dissertation says the following thing, and by the way, it was reflected in your report, that in infantile patients group with organic non-psychotic disorders, the indicators of all the components of general and emotional intelligence are much higher than in non-infantile adolescents of the same nosological group. And in schizotypal, that's a completely different situation. And how can you explain, and what are your ideas about the possible explanations why are PI doing better than non-PI? We can explain it by the fact that there is a need in more communication in such adolescents in order to compensate for the inability to comply with the social conditions. And that is why they are mostly oriented on listening to what happens outside, in the outside environment, and they are making and they are performing the tests that are more oriented on communication. And as for the general results, why is their general intelligence proved to be higher, or is it just a statistic issue? I believe it's relevant to increase the sampling, because in fact that's the level of statistic mistake, because the number of patients is insufficient for us. If we are talking about each and every small subgroup, 35 person each, statistically it's not very credible. Yes, the differences are received, they are credible, but still we can continue the study. Yes, if we study it further on, I believe we can have some corrections here. Thank you very much. It's clear. If there are no questions on the report, yes, please. You mentioned the patients with organic pathology as one of the models of your research, along with schizophrenia disorders, personality disorders, and so on. Do you have any material that can support the factual situation that you've outlined with organic pathology in adolescents? So have you researched these adolescents for the qualification of what you call an organic pathology. For example, neuroinfections, neurotraumas, and so on. Do you have any materials, objective materials, the clinical materials on that support the idea and the credibility of this model that you use in your research? Thank you. In the research of domestic psychiatrists, we see certain attention to the physiology factor of infantilism formation, including those with organic pathology patients. And part of this research is rather old, and it was not renewed. And we don't have a lot of research on this topic right now, and they are rather general. Therefore, it's quite complicated to talk about some specific points in this sphere. Therefore, we were mostly based upon the description of many sources. We've selected from these sources in order to make up this general image, because there is not a lot of research in this sphere, unfortunately. Thank you, but I would like to specify. We're talking about the group that you've researched. What is the background, medical background, the conclusions, the results of clinical research? What are you referring to when you talk about an organic pathology? Well, as I am an employee of the Department of Adolescent Psychology, jointly with psychiatrists of our department, we've selected the adolescents. Psychiatrists made a diagnosis, and they said that they are suitable for my study, and therefore I included them in my research. That is why it's not very easy for me to answer from the psychiatric point of view, but as for the general situation, I can say the following thing. These adolescents had minimal cerebral dysfunctions in the childhood, and quite frequently they had certain traumas, cerebral traumas, repeated ones, but this was not a level of some serious violation. Unfortunately, we have a problem with Skype. Just a second. Dear colleagues, we have to stop for several minutes to connect to our Bulgarian colleague, because we lost the connection.
Мы можем продолжать?
Can we continue? Yes, thank you. Have you finished the answer? Yes, I would like to add a bit. As these are the patients that were in our psychiatric clinic, we had comprehensive research with them, and we had an opportunity to analyze their medical background, and we were based on some objective research, including EEG, for example, that gave us an opportunity to assess and to say that that is an organic disorder to some or other extent. Thank you. Thank you. Do I get it right that you are based upon the expert conclusion of the clinicists? Yes, because I'm not a clinical expert, and therefore I was based on the opinions of clinicists and psychiatrists in this field. Thank you. Dear colleagues, if no questions are left, therefore we are shifting to the reports of the members of the dissertation board, and I would like to ask Mr. Wasserman to give his report. So please. Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Distinguished colleagues, Sergei Nikolaevich, Liudmila, Aleksandrovna. Allow me to give my report. Well, currently psychic infantilism is a problem that is widely discussed in psychiatry and in clinical psychology. Within the framework of these disorders, the understanding of PI is frequently mentioned in different forms of personality disorders, in schizophrenia, in organic non-psychotic disorder, and, for example, in some works of Andrei Lichko on schizophrenia in adolescents, PI as a certain definition is not mentioned. And we can't see it in the thesaurus of psychic pathology, but this phenomenon still to some extent is disclosed in the range of descriptions of neurological disorders and syndromes in adolescents. For example, the syndrome of Glatzel-Huber, for example, the syndrome of endogenous asthenic disorder, and so on. And Andrei Lichko also specifies that clinical manifestations of this schizophrenia or such neighbors of progradient schizophrenia and their clinical characteristics, they can resemble some indefinite PI definition, and they can be observed in adults as well. That is why they all chosen this PI definition linking to MKB-10 F06.6 and F068, though in these sections the PI definition is not used. From our point of view, F070 is more suitable for the organic disorders of personality, but I should note at once that the clinical groups, the organic non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorders, F121, in disease classifications, they are chosen adequately from the point of view of relevance in descriptions of the manifestations for the relevant research. Here I'm referring to phenomenology and to structural phenomena of the disorders of cognitive emotional sphere, and the direct analogy of a PI with the above-mentioned psychic disorders is not given. Yet it is considered as a research model of multidimensional psychodiagnosis, and I would like to remind that the diagnosis schizotypal disorder by the recommendation of the International Classification of Diseases of our 10th issue is rather dubious, therefore using it formally is something that should not be done. Along with that, the topic of the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva is relevant because the very notion of PI and its content that is not met in classical psychiatry literature is something that is very poorly studied, especially if we talk about some normal and pathological psychic infantilism. The question on whether psychic infantilism is a polymorphous state or a nosological structure is still unresolved. It's obvious that according to a literature overview of the author, and it's well demonstrated there, that's result of different forms of pathology and disantogenesis processes that are based on biopsychological, biopsycho and socio-cultural aspect. And as it is supported by the author, there is a need for psychodiagnosis tests of comparative character that can be targeted at differentiation of different forms of this disorder in emotional and in cognitive field. This requires to develop further empirical data in order to get some practical hands-on results. As it was already mentioned, this phenomenon recently received its clinical definition, predominantly in neurotic and psychosomatic disorders. And psychiatry lacks a unified view on the borders of the very same notion, and it also lacks the criteria of normal and pathological PI. And there is still an ongoing discussion on the impact of emotional and cognitive factor into the clinical picture of infantilism. There are a lot of problems that arise in studying PI when we see the lack of systemic phenomenology described for this event. This actually hinders its empirical study. Therefore, relevance of the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva is, on the one hand, in the need for psychological operationalization, dubious category of PI, and on the other hand, that's a referral to classical problems, not only the clinical ones, the clinical psychology, but also the correlation of affect, intelligence, and personality, and the study of PI from the point of view of its role in pathogenesis of schizotypal disorder and organic non-psychotic disorders, and definition of cognitive and emotional personal characteristics and its psychological structure, taking into account the age peculiarities. That's an important goal for scientific research. And as for the novelty and the difficulties, I believe they are quite obvious. We have a polyparametric method to assess the events in PI that give us an opportunity to compare it with compare its structural characteristics when we have different pathologies, and we can compare it with healthy adolescents. And we also see the discussion of the model of unity of affect and intelligence, where emotional intelligence is believed to be the systemic factor, and psychic infantilism, the type of nosology, they are outbound factors. And this mostly outlines the scientific novelty and the practical application for the dissertation research. PI, and the majority of authors reflected, is considered from the point of view of the specificity of individual differences in the process of the development or dysontogenesis, and that is important for interdisciplinary research in medicine, in pedagogics, and so on. And the author emphasizes the role of syndrome approach, taking into account the role of the unity of the structure, neurobiological ones and sociocultural ones, in the formation of PI. This position is conditional in adolescence, and that's quite adequate. And as for the essence of work, here we're talking about some experimental psychological research of pathogenetic mechanisms, cognitive ones, emotional ones, in correlation with the establishment of adequate behavior in adolescents with PI, depending on the form of pathology, or rather nosology, compared to the norm. And we see the discussion of psychic infantilism as a psychic, so-called malformation, and its impact and involvement in the notion of self-fulfillment, taking into account the sociogenic factors. Thus, we see the formulation of the goals of research, and they are scientifically important for sure, and they are outlined quite specifically and adequately. And in accordance with the goals of research, Ms. Dementyeva chose the group of patients for the research. It was already mentioned, and the methods of research. The methods include the classical ones, methods of expert assessment, clinical, psychological discussions, the analysis of medical background, and experimental psychological method. Wechsler test, for example, emotional intelligence test, projective method of non-existent animals, and so on. And as for justification of the methods, I believe the dissertation didn't pay a lot of attention to that, as well as to the description of the sampling of the patients, the clinical symptoms of the major group with organic non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorders, and so on. They are not specifically outlined, and further on they are not analyzed in correlation combinations. Yet overall it should be mentioned that the structure of the work is quite good and it's quite logic, and the text reflects it. The text contains the traditional sections, and as for theoretical substantiation, we see a detailed description of different classical and state-of-the-art theories and concepts, both domestic ones and foreign ones, the concept of psychic infantilism, the interdependence of emotions and intelligence, the peculiarities of adolescent age, and we also see the description of research for the chosen clinical groups. And the overview is really extensive. 199 Russian sources and over 40 English sources, and this reflects an in-depth analysis. As for the methods, here we see the description of methods and the number of patients that participated, 245 people. As for empirical research, we see the general summarization of the results, and here we have a lot of graphs and tables. And the discussion the text includes the consideration of results of multidimensional research in the context of Russian and foreign literature. And these sections are fulfilled in traditional form, but I believe they require certain editing. And I can say for sure that the benefit of this work is its empiric part. The results received in patients, and a huge number of patients, allow us to make important conclusions on the interaction between emotions and intelligence in norm and in psychopathology. And here we have organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders as examples, and the author outlined qualitative and quantitative differences in the system of interrelation of emotions and intelligence that are dependent on the conditions of general intelligence, the opportunity of self-regulation, nosological peculiarities, and the presence of PI. And we see the compensation function of emotional intelligence at a group of patients with organic non-psychotic disorders with the traits of psychological immaturity. And here is the reference with PI as for the author. So that is the importance, scientific importance. But the results can be used also to improve the reliability of differential diagnosis, to develop some correction programs targeted at the stimulation of cognitive functional systems, at training people with skills of detecting and differentiation of emotional states in different conditions, and also the skills of functioning and detection of emotions in other people. And here we can also talk about self-regulation, skills development, and social adaptation in adolescents with PI, and that is the practical significance of the work of Ms. Dementyeva. Along with that, regardless of the importance of this dissertation work, I believe it is important to pay attention to the following remarks. First, regardless of the fact that in the theoretical part we see the full description of different domestic and foreign theoretical concepts of PI, still it's not sufficiently outlined which theoretical concept is preferred by the author in operationalization of PI. Therefore, we should talk about some insufficient development of a notional set of the dissertation overall, and qualification of sampling and substantiation of diagnosis. And we don't see sufficient argumentation in the choice of methods, for example, projective, substandard methods of a non-existing animal. But in conclusion, I would like to say that the dissertation work of Ms. Dementyeva is prepared for the relevant topic for medical psychology. The information support is quite an extensive one. It is supported by the extensive block of quotations from domestic and foreign literatures for the choice of materials. I believe this can be discussed from the point of view of the set target. And as for the goals, I believe they could be more specifically described. As for the chapter on the analysis of empirical material, it is filled with abbreviations, yet it contains a lot of material for the analysis in this chapter. As for the conclusions, they mostly correspond the results, yet they could have more content based on the materials present. And as for my remarks, they are just of a work character, and as for the publications of the author, I believe that they can provide for a more in-depth understanding of PI, and regardless of the dubious character of this topic in professional community, therefore the dissertation on the interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents corresponds with the major requirements outlined by order as of September the 1st, 2016, number 6821/1, on the order of conferring the academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. Therefore, the candidate deserves the academic title of the candidate of psychology in specialization 190004 medical psychology. Item 1 is not violated. And my signature, Professor Wasserman. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Wasserman. Liudmila, could you please answer the comments and remarks? Distinguished Mr. Wasserman, in my work I analyzed the notion of psychic infantilism as a comprehensive phenomenon of medical knowledge that becomes the object of research not only in psychiatry but also in clinical psychology. And in psychiatry you pay attention to etiology, and Galerovsky, Lebedinsky, Sukhareva, they researched the physiological factors. Dzhirinsky, Boyanov, Solimovskaya and others considered psychosocial requisites. In Dinkin, Goryeva, and some others outlined the emotional and personal basis for as prerequisites for the traits of psychological immaturity. And the problem of classification of phenomenon, it was discussed both by foreign clinical experts and domestic psychiatrists, and the borders of this term were researched in Lichko and Kovaleva works. And Andrei Lichko and Viktor Lebedinsky also researched cognitive, social, emotional, personal innovations in psychic infantilism. And these clinicists studied PI in personality disorders, schizophrenia, and organic pathology, and recently it was studied as a predictor of neurotic and psychosomatic disorders. And in psychology, we see a lot of attention given to emotional and personal parameters of PI. And regardless of the variety of the research of this phenomenon, we can talk about the insufficiency of the development of the differentiation of psychological structure of infantilism. And in our work, we're talking about PI as about the violation of psychic development that has biopsychosocial factors of formation that have an impact on the establishment of emotional, personal, and cognitive sphere that reduces the opportunities for social adaptation of adolescents. And in my research, I had some experimental goals that correspond to the principles of clinical psychological research, and qualification of diagnosis was not included here. The clinical diagnosis was performed by psychiatrists of the clinical hospital number 15 of Moscow, and it was verified by the experts of the Scientific Center for Mental Health that worked in the Department of Adolescent Psychiatry. And in this work, we've undertaken an attempt to operationalize psychological phenomenology of PI through the psychological self-regulation, yet the ready-made toolkit that allows us to study these components directly of psychological self-regulation is something that is insufficient for us. And supporting the principle of this research, we believed it is important to use a comprehensive range of methods based on one classical psychological method, standardized method, and one projective method. And we also had an organizational goal to optimize psychological toolkit so that the study of one person would not exceed 3 hours, because this test took place in 2 stages and each lasted for an hour and a half. And at that, we took into account the fact that we should have some differences in the forms of activity during this research, so that those adolescents with pathology wouldn't be too exhausted by the research. And among all the projective methods, we've chosen the drawing of non-existent animal, though the method, as you've mentioned, is not standardized, but still it has certain well-developed qualitative characteristics, and it allows us to describe aggressive traits of character, anxiety, peculiarities of communication, and these corresponded with the components of psychological regulation. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. So, Liudmila, distinguished members of the board, before giving the floor to Svetlana Leonidovna, I would like to remind you on the need to stick to the time limit, because we have 10 minutes for the speech of every member of the dissertation board. Thank you very much, and now I would like to give the floor to Madam Solovyova. Thank you very much, distinguished Olga Yurievna, distinguished colleagues. The problem of interaction between emotions and intelligence is disclosed in the study of PI and the model of organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders. This topic is quite state-of-the-art and relevant when we study organic PI, and here the role of cognitive insufficiency is still a discussion issue. Insufficient study of patients with organic non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorders in adolescent age demonstrates the need to expand the knowledge on cognitive and emotional characteristics of patients in these nosological groups, considering the fact of psychic infantilism. And it is outlined by theoretical and practical relevance. Infantilism is considered as a comprehensive clinical psychological phenomenon regarding which we see a lack of systemically described phenomenology, and that hinders its operationalization. The psychic infantilism was studied in different fields as a phenomenon of norm and pathology, yet its borders and criteria for differentiation, they are not strictly outlined. And in contemporary works, we see the notion of emotional intelligence that allows us to describe the mutual dependence of emotional reactions and intelligence. And within the framework of historic approach and activity approach, this unity is considered from the point of view of the influence of emotions and as a basis of our sphere for cognition. And the support of self-identity in adolescents play an important role, as well as competence that is described by emotional intelligence as a set of skills that can hinder the detection of emotions, and that is explained by the development of skills, social roles, development, and the opportunity for empathy and self-control. Emotional intelligence in adolescent age is an important element between social emotional spheres. The material of research included the patients with organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders. 245 adolescents took part in the research from 15 to 18, and 105 of them were the adolescents that had no psychic pathology, and the group was divided into 3 equal parts. 140 adolescents were in the experimental clinical group that was divided into 4 subgroups according to the nosology and PI. And the theoretical methodological basis of work involved the provisions of cultural historical theory of Vygotsky, here we're talking about the regulation of psychic function in domestic psychology and about the principles of qualitative analysis in the application of experimental methods in pathopsychology and the concept of emotional intelligence. The goal was to establish the connections between emotions and intelligence in adolescents, and as for the object of research, those were the patients with PI, and as for the subject, those were the peculiarities of interdependence of emotions and intelligence of patients with organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypic disorders. And as for the goals, here we had the psychological phenomena detection among 2 groups of patients. As for the novelty and theoretical importance, the work offered the polyparametric method of assessment of PI, and for the first time the interdependence of emotions and intelligence is represented as a unity that includes 3 components: general and emotional intelligence and self-regulation. And here emotional intelligence is the systemic factor, and we've outlined system connections of emotions and intelligence. And as for the practical importance, the results of work can be used for differentiated approach development to the problem of PI, and also to improve the efficiency of treatment and social adaptation of adolescents. The results can be used also for the development of psychic correction programs targeted at the improvement of the development of cognitive functions, and also differentiation of emotional states and the formation of cultural self-regulation methods, and the credibility of the results. Assessing the credibility of the results, it should be noted that it is based on the conceptual provisions that provide for interdisciplinary approach on the study of the problem, representative sampling, analysis of the material, and the combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis, and the use of adequate methods of statistical processing for statistical data. The credibility of provisions is provided by adequate methods of the goals, and by the comprehensive approach in the choice of methods, correct analysis, and data representation and correspondence of conclusions to the goals. And also we see an in-depth analysis of experimental sources on the issue. The correctness of the research and logical substantiation make this data a contribution to the medical psychology. And as for the new results, the candidate proposes that interdependence between emotions and intelligence can be represented as a system of unity of affect and intelligence, including 3 components: general, emotional intelligence, and psychological self-regulation. As for pathology, this combination and this unity is something that we like, while the normative is outlined by the general intelligence. The structure and the hierarchy of the general intelligence in each of the nosological groups is not changed due to lack of presence of PI. And in group with organic non-psychotic disorders, the indicators of the general intelligence in PI patients is higher than in non-PI ones, and for schizotypal disorder group, the correlation is vice versa. Psychic infantilism has a nosodependent structure, and it is represented by peculiarities of emotional, social, and personal self-regulation as components of self-regulation. And in accordance with the results, considering the hierarchy of components and expression levels of general intelligence, some of the patients demonstrate relevance with the healthy group, and as for organic non-psychotic disorder group, nonverbal demonstrations are higher, and schizotypal disorders it's relatively higher than norm. And in clinical groups, the emotional intelligence is higher, and the structure of emotional intelligence is differentiated. In the norm, the leading component is the understanding of emotion. In organic disorder group, that's the detection of emotions, and in schizotypal group, that's the help for cognition. And in group with organic non-psychotic disorder without PI, we've detected a low level of emotional and personal self-regulation that is reflected in the high level of anxiety, aggressiveness, impulsiveness, and the reduction of the skills of social interaction and communication opportunities. And in the group with organic non-psychotic disorder with PI, we've detected a high level of emotional, social, and personal component for self-regulation. And that is, by the way, the role of social component, and it is pronounced at the orientation for social approval and was correlated with the suppression of anxiety and hostility, the development of social skills, and higher self-esteem. And in schizotypal disorder without PI, we've seen lack of social and personal self-regulation that is reflected in the high level of hostility, low impulsiveness, the registration of parameters of anxiety, a deficit of orientation in the context of social interaction, low communication of skills, and low self-esteem. And in schizotypal disorder group with PI, we've detected a lower level compared with adolescents of schizotypal disorder without PI, level of emotional, social, personal components of self-regulation, and this was pronounced in more pronounced anxiety, impulsiveness, hostility, and less development of communication skills, worse orientation in the social context. As for the questions, no principal remarks, but along with that I can form certain questions and remarks that do not reduce the high mark. First, it would be useful to form a conceptual but not empiric notion of psychological self-regulation. The term psychic self-regulation is outlined as a systemic process that provides for the adequate flexibility of the life of subject at all the levels. Second, how can you explain the detected peculiarities of psychic and psychological self-regulation compared with between the groups? Third, the description of methods used and the interpretation could be given in an appendix, I believe. And fourth, a lot of abbreviations hinder the reading of the text. And conclusion. The dissertation of Liudmila Dementyeva on the topic of interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism, submitted for the defense on the Specialization 19-00004, corresponds with the basic requirements of the order on the order of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, and the candidate deserves the academic degree of the candidate of psychology in Specialization 19-00004, and the item 1 is not violated. That's it. Thank you very much. Liudmila, please answer the questions. The research. In our research, we talk about psychological self-regulation as about an integral structure that includes the opportunities for reflection and regulation of emotional states, assessment of social situations, self-cognition, the understanding of your will, that favors the adaptation to the changing social conditions. And thus, psychological self-regulation in our work is considered by the prism of functioning of emotional, personal sphere in the social context. The results of research of psychological self-regulation demonstrated that PI adolescents with organic disorders compared with adolescents without PI have a high level of psychological self-regulation with a leading role of social component. And these results are explained by hypercompensation mechanism. PI adolescents with schizotypal disorder have a lower level of psychological self-regulation, and this demonstrates the aggravation of nosological traits. And if we compare the results in clinical groups without PI, we believe that they are correspondent with the concept of dysontogenesis of Mr. Libudinsky. And the group with organic disorders, we provide for the mechanism of insufficient development for self-regulation, and in schizotypal development, the mechanism of asynchrony. Yet, to support such ideas, we need to organize further research to compare the opportunities of self-regulation in the norm and in psychopathology. The description of methods really take a lot of volume of the dissertation, and in further works we'll try to be more compact with the description of methods, and we'll have some of the descriptions in the annex. And the text of the dissertation is quite voluminous, and therefore to optimize it, I decided to introduce this huge number of abbreviations that I explained in the end of the work, and in my future works I'll try to use them less, because yes, indeed, it really hinders the reading. Thank you. Thank you very much, Liudmila. Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Madam Malkova, Elena Evgenievna, that is with us via Skype. Distinguished chairperson, distinguished colleagues, allow me to give you my judgment on the text of the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva on interrelation between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism. Today, the problem of psychic infantilism is an important sphere of the research for psychology and psychiatry. The clinical experts study the phenomenon of PI when we have different pathologies: schizophrenia, cerebral organic pathology. And in contemporary research, we see the expansion of understanding of PI in neurotic and psychosomatic disorders. Regardless of this fact, psychiatry still lacks the overview of the borders on the norm and pathological infantilism. And there is an ongoing discussion on the influence of emotions and cognitive processes on the clinical picture of this phenomenon. Above all, in the theory of medical psychology, we still lack the systematizing of the peculiarities of PI, and this hinders the empirical studies of issues relevant to pathology. Based on that, we can say that the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva, reflecting the results of research on the interdependence between emotions and intelligence, that systematized the peculiarities of PI as clinical phenomenon by the use of classical problems of psychology on the combination of affect, intelligence, and personality is something that we see as relevant. And also methodological goals are very interesting, the ones that the author has in the work, and special attention is given by the sections on research dedicated to the role of psychic infantilism in the pathogenesis of psychotypal disorder and organic non-psychotic disorder, and also and the detection of emotional and personal cognitive components in the structure of psychological immaturity. Polyparametric means of assessment of PI offered by the dissertation creates a broad range of opportunities to compare the studied phenomenon with the use of group of adolescents with various psychic pathologies. And sure enough, the new idea is the model of the unity of affect and intelligence, in which emotional intelligence is the systemic factor. When reading the thesis, I paid attention the good structure of the text. This dissertation contains traditional sections. In theoretical section of research, we see the historic introspective of different domestic and foreign concepts of psychic infantilism, clinical ones and psychological ones. interdependence of emotions and intelligence. We see the structured peculiarities of adolescent age chose along with the goals of research. Literature overview is quite an extensive one, and it is represented by the analysis of 199 domestic and 40 foreign sources, and this allowed the author to work with theoretical and methodological construct. And in materials and methods, we see the substantiation of the choice of methods and the choice of adolescents, 245 people. This sampling is described in accordance with the goals and characteristics. In empirical research, we see the full-fledged description, qualitative and quantitative assessment, and also structured substantiation of results. As for the results, they are conveniently illustrated, and the discussion of results includes the juxtaposing of data between the domestic and foreign works. The results of the present dissertation research allows the author to approach the goals and to receive really worthy theoretical and practical conclusions. And this allowed the author to describe the level of general intelligence, the opportunities of psychological self-regulation, nosological characteristics, and the presence of PI. And an unusual result is the compensation function that was detection for emotional intelligence in the group with organic disorders. And also the benefit of this work is the discussion of results that is given in a separate chapter, and it gives the conclusion and nine conclusions that are referred as findings. And as for the results, they can be used to improve the quality of clinical diagnosis and for the development of correction programs. And I believe the view of the author on rehabilitation and habilitation and correction are interesting depending on the type of nosology, and here we see a special corresponding program in the annex. These methods are targeted at the improvement of the work of cognitive functions, the development of skills and means to regulate emotional states, and the improvement of the opportunities for social adaptation. And we should also take into account the scale of research of the problem of infantilism in adolescents with certain medical conditions, the fullness of the results, with a practical conclusion of theoretical and empirical substantiated provision on the establishment of the comprehensive range of psychocorrection methods is, I believe, very good. And 15 scientific publications were done, and 6 of them are in the journals that are recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science. Along with that, without reducing the value and importance of the dissertation work, I believe it is important to pay attention to the certain remarks. First, I don't have sufficient understanding of the theoretical concept that the author chose when she talks about the phenomenon of psychological self-regulation in adolescents with psychic infantilism. Second, during the study of phenomenon of PI, the author used the material that was received in adolescents with organic non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorder. The issue on the opportunity to define the borders of the norm is still open. Does the author believe that PI is a characteristic that is relevant only for these nosological forms, or do you exclude its presence in other pathologies? Third, have you considered the issue on the probability of the characteristics of PI in adolescents in non-organic border-like psychic disorders and norm? Or do you believe that that's a phenomenon that is relevant only for harsh pathology? And fourth, we see some spelling and punctuation mistakes that still and not damage the provisions. And in conclusion, I would like to say that the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva on the topic of interrelation of emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism corresponds with the basic requirements outlined by the order as of September the 1st, 2016, number 6821/1 on the order of conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. Therefore, the candidate, Ms. Dementyeva, deserves the academic title of the candidate of psychology in specialization 1900 for medical psychology, psychological sciences. Item 1 is not violated. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. Liudmila, could you please answer? Distinguished Elena Evgenievna, being based on the general psychological understanding, we are talking about psychological self-regulation as about an integral structure that includes the opportunities for reflection and regulation of emotional state, the assessment of social situations, self-understanding, the understanding of your desires and opportunities, and this provides for adequate flexibility of the life of the subject at any level. And in this research, we've compared all the variety of clinical psychological phenomenology of PI with psychological self-regulation at emotional, social, and personal level, in accordance with the spheres that PI has an influence on. And in this study, we've chosen two clinical groups of adolescents with organic non-psychotic and psychotypal disorders. That's, by the way, a widespread situation among adolescents that asks for inpatient and outpatient counseling. And here we see some immaturity and a difference in intelligence. Psychic infantilism is noted in other nosological groups, including the patients with personal pathology and psychosomatic disorder. And the study of psychic infantilism in adolescents can be a continuation of the present research, because that is a promising field for clinical psychology. And according to the literature, we see a separate norm of psychic infantilism, social infantilism, and this sphere is poorly studied. And here I'm referring to adolescents without pathology, and here we should prepare an extensive range of psychodiagnosis toolkit. The research of this phenomenon can be an important contribution to the study of the program of division between the norm and pathology of psychic infantilism, and will provide us the opportunity to detect some characteristics in non-organic border-like psychic disorders. I do really have some spelling and punctuation mistakes. Thank you very much for paying attention to that, and in my future research I'll try to stay away from such mistakes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. Liudmila, pardon. Now I would like to give the floor to our Bulgarian colleague, Professor Matanova-Kovaleva, Vanya Lukova. So please, you have the floor. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues, distinguished chairperson. Allow me to give you my report on the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva. So, as for the relevance of the study, today, psychic infantilism as a phenomenon makes up a discussion aspect. Everyone noted that psychic infantilism was researched during the personality disorder, schizophrenia, organic pathology, and as a predictor of neurotic and neurosomatic disorders. In specialized literature, we don't see the description of differences in the structure of infantilism in different nosologies. Interdependence of emotions and intelligence usually are operationalized by the construct of emotional intelligence that in adolescent age is a connective element between social, emotional, and intellectual spheres. And still we don't see a lot of research in clinical psychological characteristics of the patients with organic non-psychotic disorders and schizotypal disorders in adolescent age. Both for theory and for practice, there is a need to expand the knowledge on cognitive, emotional, and personal peculiarities in these patients, considering the PI factor. The goal of the dissertation is Well, the major goal of the dissertation is to establish the connections between emotions and intelligence, the peculiarities of emotional and personal sphere, and the structure of intelligence in adolescents with PI. To implement this goal, the author formed two groups: adolescents with organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders. Based on the results and the present therapeutic programs, the recommendations were devised to increase their cognitive, emotional, and social potential. Scientific novelty and the practical importance. Theoretical importance is in the expansion of the scientific understanding of psychic infantilism and interdependence between emotions and intelligence. The term infantilism is widely applied, but up until now we haven't outlined the criteria for its analysis, for the analysis of its structure. And in the work of the candidate, for the first time we see the polyparametric approach for the assessment of PI, and this is the basis for the development of multidimensional criteria to define and systematize the PI. For the first time, we see the analysis of interdependence of emotions and intelligence as a unity system that includes three components: general intelligence, emotional intelligence, and psychological self-regulation. General and emotional intelligence are included into the general structure of intelligence, and emotional one is a systemic factor. The author analyzed both intrasystemic factors, general intelligence and psychological self-regulation, and autosystemic factors, psychological infantilism and nosology. Practical importance is connected with the development of a differentiated approach to the problem of psychic infantilism, which is needed for psychocorrection and rehabilitation work to improve the efficiency of the therapy of adolescents with psychic infantilism and organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders. As for the substantiation of scientific provisions and conclusions, the dissertation has a comprehensive approach. The author used standardized psychodiagnosis methods and applied quantitative analysis of results, and this outlines the substantiation of scientific provisions and conclusions. The empirical research supported the credibility of the hypothesis and provisions that are offered for the defense. The hierarchy of components of intelligence in the group of adolescents with schizotypal disorder, where verbal intelligence is higher than non-verbal one, can be coordinated with the characteristics of distorted psychic development, and this is explained by the mechanism of asynchrony. Asynchrony of intellectual development in schizotypal group is connected with the quick pace or in the formation of verbal characteristics. The structure and hierarchy of components is not changed in nosological groups. With PI, the level and structure of general intelligence is not connected with infantilism, and it is established that the lower the general and verbal intelligence, the higher emotional intelligence and its components. In the group of patients with psychic infantilism, we see the lack of specific correlations between the components of emotional intelligence. We see the reduction of these correlation ties that demonstrates the reduction of coordination of the general intelligence structure. The psychic infantilism deteriorates compensation opportunities in schizotypal disorder group, and qualitative differences were not detected. In the group with organic non-psychotic disorder, the leading component is the detection of emotions, and in psychotypal group, verbal intelligence. And also a compensation function of emotional intelligence was detected in a group of organic disorder patients. And in this group, the formation of the development of psychic infantilism is explained by infantilizing factor, and in psychotypal group by nosological factor. In the group of adolescents with non-psychotic disorders, we see a high level of psychological self-regulation and the leading role of social component. And among the adolescents with psychotypal disorder with infantilism, we see a lower level of psychological self-regulation. The recommendations for psychocorrection works based on the comprehensive neuropsychological correction to improve the cognitive functions the detecting and control of emotions, and a special place in the correction work is given to the consultation work with parents and with teachers, and the results can be used to improve the quality of differentiated diagnosis and to develop the correction programs. And my questions are as follows. I have two questions. The first one, the patients can be referred to psychotypal personal disorder type F21.8 or to schizophrenic spectrum. And what are the bases to compare the data with schizophrenia in adults if the candidate writes on page 101 that not on any stage of the disease we detect the distortions characteristic for schizophrenia. The conclusion. The dissertation work of Ms. Dementyeva is a scientific qualification work that analyzes theoretical provisions and received empirical data that can be qualified as well-planned and performed work on medical psychology. The dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva on the topic of interrelation of emotions and intelligence in adolescents with psychic infantilism corresponds the major requirements outlined by Order as of September the 1st, 2016, number 6821./1 on the order of conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the candidate, Ms. Dementyeva, deserves the academic degree of the candidate of psychology in specialization 190004 medical psychology. And the order, point 1 of the order is not violated. Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. The answer. Distinguished Professor Matanova, the clinical group of adolescents with schizotypal disorder includes the patients with diagnosis that are corresponding the criteria of F21 group that have no psychotic symptoms with a lengthy period of disease, and above this neurosis-like and psychopathology-like types. This group included the adolescents with forming psychotypal disorder, F21.8. And grouping the patients like that, we were based on the clinical psychological understanding of the schizophrenia syndrome that allows us to bring all these topics together. And we did not include the patients that had or have psychotic symptoms and also pronounced harsh defects of negative disorders. Therefore, we excluded the diagnosis of schizophrenia F20. Yet, in a number of cases, we have negative symptoms that were rather delicately pronounced, and this allowed us to compare the results of the current study with the data received on schizophrenia patients dedicated to the description of peculiarities of their cognitive and emotional personal spheres. The comparison of our patients with adult patients allows us to coordinate the peculiarities of psychic sphere among adolescents and adults, and this allows us to compare the differences in the age factor and provides the opportunities to extrapolate a range of trends for the future, and this can be important as for the forecast. Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. Thank you very much, Liudmila. And allow me to give my review of the chairperson of the dissertation board for the dissertation of Ms. Dementyeva. The relevance of the topic. The dissertation research of Ms. Dementyeva is dedicated to the comprehensive range of psychological characteristics of adolescents with PI and without it. There are two clinical groups that we know, the adolescents with organic non-psychotic disorders and psychotypal disorders. The relevance of the research is outlined by the fact that the patients with the so-called borderline states, especially the schizotype disorder, are not always viewed and met by the experts, don't get adequate medical help, and feel quite serious problems at school and in social environment. And differential diagnostic criteria are not outlined for these deviations, and these groups of adolescents are not studied enough in the clinical and psychological field, and few specialized programs for rehabilitation were devised for such adolescents, and in this work we study yet another specialized and narrow group of adolescents, the above mentioned ones. The adolescents that combine the organic non-psychotic disorder with PI, and this requires certain development of programs of psychological counseling. And it should be noted that such research requires extensive clinical psychological experience and delicate individualized psychological diagnosis that corresponds to the contemporary personal centralized humanitarian paradigm of psychiatry and psychology. Scientific importance was supported by the fact that one of the groups were made up by healthy adolescents, and thus the dissertation research of Ms. Dementyeva is relevant, state-of-the-art, and important for medical psychology. The general goal of the dissertation research was specified at 5 goals, and fulfillment of them in combination allowed us to support the main hypothesis of the research on the existence of qualitative and quantitative differences in the general structure of intelligence in adolescents with psychic deviations depending on the nosological background and the presence or lack of PI. And also the hypothesis on the coherence with nosology with PI represented by emotional, social, and personal components of psychological self-regulation was present. In order to implement the goals, we see the methodological toolkit development that allowed to comprehensively study the structure of general and emotional intelligence and to some extent assess the peculiarities of psychic self-regulation among the adolescents. And we used the adaptive scale for the research of intelligence in adults by the excellent test of emotional intelligence, but still the questions arise due to the choice of the experimental clinical procedure of the research of self-esteem provided by Susanna Rubinstein, and in particular projective method of the drawing of a non-existent animal. Well recommended in individual psychological counseling, but very rarely used in scientific research. And in order to detect qualitative peculiarities for self-regulation, the used clinical psychological methods were very adequate. Those that correspond to domestic traditions of in-depth and individualized psychological diagnosis, the study of background, psychodiagnosis, talk, and the method of expert assessment. And the advantage of this work is the use of all the empirical data and all methods of mathematical statistics that provide for the credibility of the research results. The material of the dissertation work includes the data of psychological research of 245 adolescents aged 15-17 years, and 105 adolescents made up the normative group. These were the school students, divided into 3 groups according to the level of intelligence. Experimental group included 140 adolescents, 70 with diagnosis organic non-psychotic disorder, and 70 with diagnosis schizotypal disorder. Each of the nosology group, based on the data of the questionnaire, PI expression level, and expert assessment of psychiatrists of the above mentioned institutions where these adolescents were treated. The groups of adolescents were outlined with presence or lack of PI. Each group contained 35 people, and dissertation provided an analysis of empirical material received in 7 groups of adolescents, and the design is a correlation one. A comprehensive yet well-pronounced program of the research allowed the author to get new varied results that are structured and analyzed in the 3rd chapter of the dissertation. While the results of the research, 9 conclusions are being made, and though their number exceeds the general number of conclusions in dissertations, they are quite logical. Finishing the dissertation research correspond with its goals and reflect the key content of the work. And as well as the provisions for defense, they reflect the scientific novelty, theoretical importance, that is as follows. Scientific novelty of the dissertation is contained in theoretical and in empirical parts based on the analysis of the classical and contemporary domestic and foreign literatures. Psychological phenomenology of PI in the present work is represented as a peculiarity of deviation of psychological self-regulation, and here are three components: emotional, social, and personal. And empirical research demonstrates that psychic infantilism with psychic disorders of non-psychotic type can not only be characterized by the correlation of components of psychological self-regulation, but also outlines its nosology-specific peculiarities. And it is established that for adolescents with organic disorder of psyche and psychic infantilism, we see the high level of psychic self-regulation than in the patients with the very same nosology group without PI. The group with schizotypal disorder, it's vice versa. The correlation reflects the reduction of indicators of psychological self-regulation among infantile adolescents compared with non-infantile ones, and this data are the new ones, and they can be used as guidance for clinical diagnosis. For the first time in chapter 1 and in the discussion of results, we see the analysis of domestic and foreign works dedicated to different aspects of PI. And here is the theoretical importance of the dissertation work for the general adult and medical psychology. And in from the point of view of theory, the received data can add up for the understanding of the interrelation between emotions and intelligence. In the dissertation, this connection is represented as a unity of three components: general intelligence, emotional intelligence, and psychological self-regulation. That in turn includes the emotional, social, personal components. For medical psychology and border psychiatry, the fact that is proven in the dissertation that there is a nosological dependency is of particular importance. An interesting yet a discussion point is the point on the fact that in pathology the interdependence between the general and emotional intelligence, reflecting the level of unity between affect and intelligence, is something that we lack, yet in the norm it is outlined by the level of general intelligence. The practical importance of the research of Ms. Dementyeva stems from the received results of empirical research that are capable to be as guidelines for the development of specialized programs of psychological therapy and social rehabilitation for such adolescents. And in Annex 2, the opportunities of psychological correction of infantile adolescents with psychic disorders, we see detailed recommendations and basic fields of work to optimize cognitive skills, emotional competences, and socio-communicational activity of this category of patients. Then the structure of dissertation, I won't dwell upon that, because that's just formal information that was voiced before, but I would like to mention that the results are mentioned in 15 scientific works, and 6 of them are published in the recommended publications. So the dissertation contains new results. The author gives us the well-formulated provisions for the defense that have an important scientific and practical importance for medical psychology. As for my comments, as it was mentioned, it's interesting for the theory but requires discussion. Here I'm referring to the provision of the author, that in pathology the interdependence between the general and emotional intelligence reflects the level of unity between affect and intelligence is something that will lack, while in the norm it is outlined by the general intelligence level. If this provision is formulated based by the results of correlation analysis only, then it can be considered as a bold one. Therefore, I need explanations for that. Second, the text of the dissertation emphasizes the three-component structure of psychological self-regulation, including the emotional, social, and personal components. And it's quite logical to think that the used methods of psychological diagnosis should be used for each of these components, yet it's not the case. And the choice of the methods of the study of psychological self-regulation by the authors are not obvious and requires explanation. Third, dissertation work is dedicated to the study of interdependence between emotions and intelligence in adolescents with border psychological disorders and PI. Yet, the issue on the role of social, microsocial factors cannot be fully ignored when we study psychic infantilism that is demonstrated by certain psychic regulation, self-esteem, emotional intelligence. Yet, the dissertation does not pay a lot of attention to this topic, and that's true for analytical overview of literature and to the characteristics of the sampling that does not reflect the social and family situation of the adolescents. And as for the importance of psychological works, or psychological work with relatives, it is mentioned just in one line of Annex 2. Fourth, adolescent psychiatry works of Interrelation gives us such a diagnosis: a psychopathy, harsh psychopathy combined with PI. And professor notes that 18-year-old looks like 15-year-old. The question: have you seen in literature, maybe in personal clinical experience, have you seen the data on the correlation between delicate physical constitution and psychic infantilism? So this comment do not reduce the importance of the work and the relevance of the topic. The results can be quite in demand among the clinical experts and other experts working in this field of adolescent psychiatry, and it should be separately noted. The scope of work should be separately noted. The conclusion: the dissertation of Liudmila Dementyeva on the topic of interrelation of emotions and intelligence in adolescents with PI corresponds with the basic requirements outlined by Order as of September 1st, 2016, number 6821/1 on the order of conferring academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. And the candidate, Ms. Dementyeva, deserves the academic degree of the candidate of psychology in specialization 190004 for medical psychology, psychological works. Item 11 is not violated by the candidate. Thank you. So please answer the questions. Distinguished Olga Yurievna, the provisions for the defense in pathology, the correlation between general and emotional intelligence reflecting the level of unity of affect and intelligence is something that we like, but in the norm it is outlined by the general intelligence. It is based on the general correlation analysis, and the results of correlation analysis are coordinated with the qualitative analysis. The general structure of intelligence is balanced in the group of norm, and we can find the regularity. The higher the general intelligence, the higher the emotional intelligence, and in clinical groups we see lack of coordination with the structure of intelligence. In organic non-psychotic disorders, the leading component is the detection of emotions, and in schizotypal group verbal intelligence. If we consider the hierarchy of the structure of general intelligence, the results can be explained from the point of view of Mr. Lebedynsky. In the norm, we have heterochrome principle of the development, and in the structure of general intelligence, nonverbal cognitive processes are well developed, more developed than the verbal ones. And as for emotional intelligence, among its components, we see the prevalence of the understanding of emotions, and the change in hierarchy of the general structure of intelligence in clinical groups is connected with the violation of heterochrony of development. And a group with organic non-psychotic disorders, we can talk about the mechanism of underdevelopment of cognitive and emotional spheres. because the level of general intelligence is reduced compared with the norm. And as for emotional intelligence, we see the high indications in a detection of emotions, and that is characteristic for earlier period of the development. And in schizotypal group, we can talk about synchronous mechanism. And in the structure of general intelligence, we see the prevalence of verbal intelligence, and in emotional intelligence, the aid to thinking. And comparing the variety of clinical psychological phenomenology of PI, we're talking about three levels: emotional, social, and personal ones. These parameters are sufficient for our research, but do not cover the variety of phenomena of psychological self-regulation. And as for the methodological instruments targeted directly at the study of self-regulation aspects, it proved to be insufficient. Therefore, we've chosen the methods of diagnosis that correspond with the psychological research. For example, the qualitative and quantitative indicators that allow us to assess the necessary parameters fully without paying a lot of time during the test, because these methods of Wechsler test and emotional intelligence tests require a lot of time, and psychic disorder adolescents are easily exhausted, and this limit restricts the time of researchers. And the topic of family impact on PI is really an important one, and in the present research we've discussed the works of Buyanov, Kovalyova, Sukhareva, Lebedinskaya, and others that marked the presence of PI, infantilized character, or secondary infantilism in the conditions of incorrect upbringing. And here we can see the deprivation systems and other explanations for that. And indirectly we are considering this issue when we consider the literature dedicated to the role of family factor on the establishment of emotional intelligence. Yet the specific overview of this topic would require to change the design of the research, and this would make it very, very voluminous. Here I'm referring to the construct of the research, and this wasn't the goal of the research. And as for the literature sources, we find a lot of confirmations to the fact that infantilism can be pronounced not only at the psychic level but also have correlations with physical retardation. And one of the early descriptions of infantilism belonged to Laurent, that in 1871 outlined the range of retarded in development people that retained all the adolescent characteristics that are pronounced in height, proportions of the body, and psyche. And many authors now describe that there's a relevance between retardation and infantilism. And here we're talking about the influence of physiological factors in the etiology of this phenomenon that can influence not only the psychic retardation but also some bodily functions. And Sukhareva outlined harmonic infantilism that is characterized by the coordination with an early level of psychic development of a child and correlation with infantile proportions. And among this harmonious infantilism, she described an option when the lagging behind of emotional and personal sphere goes together with hypergenitalism. And Mr. Lichko talks about infantilism as a considers infantilism as a retardation of psychic and physical development. And Mr. Vygotsky supports this idea, yet not always psychic infantilism corresponds with retardation in bodily functions. And in our patients we had the ones that had certain retardation in body development, but in organic disorder group we had patients that had certain retardation of certain genital functions. And in schizotypal disorder we had this misformation in the urges. Thank you very much, Liudmila, for a detailed answer, for the detailed answers. Dear colleagues, as we didn't get any external reports, we can shift to the colleagues that are present here in the hall that are not included in the board, if someone wants to comment. No one? Okay, then I give the floor to the scientific advisor, Mr. Nikolopov. Distinguished members of the board, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak out. I've been working together with her for many years, over 10 years, and I'll be really short. You see the materials of work that demonstrate that that's a very industrious person and very attentive and very reliable in two ways. Reliable as regards to the results of work, and reliable as a person. And basically, such characteristics are pronounced in very hard conditions, because working with adolescents, even with normal ones, is really hard. And when we talk about adolescent patients, is even harder. But she can find common grounds with such adolescents to communicate with them, and above all, she has been working not in a homogeneous environment of clinical psychologists, but also communicates with psychiatrists, and this creates certain problems. Yet, all the same, she is really friendly and reliable, and thus she creates a good, friendly atmosphere in our teams and with patients. And in this regard, that's a pleasure to be a scientific advisor for such a person. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sergey. Distinguished colleagues. Now we're going to have a 5-minute discussion between the members of the dissertation board. We're going to discuss the issue of conferring the academic degree to Ms. Dementyeva. During that period of time, I asked to turn off the broadcast. And as for the guests that are not members of the dissertation board, I kindly ask you to leave the hall and to give us the opportunity to discuss the results of our today's of the session. Please make sure it works and everything is okay. Thank you. In this case, I would like to discuss the topic of our open balloting, and let me remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Board on conferring the academic degree is positive provided more than 50% of the board members, but not fewer than 3 people voted in favor. In conformity with Section 23 of the Order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, the Annex 1 to the order. So, Mr. Wasserman, your opinion? I support the granting of academic degree. Thank you. Madam Slavyova, I support. Ms. Malkova, I fully support. Ms. Vanyalukova, I support the granting of academic degree, fully support. Thank you very much. And I would like to join my colleagues and vote for the granting of the academic degree to Liudmila Dementyeva, the degree of the candidate of psychology in a medical psychology specialization. Thus, the vote count won't take too much time. Distinguished colleagues and guests, I would like to announce that out of 5 members of the board, 5 voted for granting the academic degree, no one voted against, and no one abstained from the vote. Therefore, the decision on granting the academic degree of the candidate of psychology in specialization 190004, medical psychology, to Liudmila Dementyeva is taken unanimously. So, we would like to congratulate our candidate and would like to give you the floor for the concluding remarks. Distinguished Chairwoman, dear members of the board, allow me to thank you for the opportunity to deliver my presentation and for the opportunity to discuss the relevant issues on it. I would like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Nikolov, my scientific advisor that supported me in many aspects and helped me a lot in my work. And I would like to thank my department of the Scientific Center of Mental Health, the Adolescent Psychiatry Department, and I would like to thank Professor and Dr. Natalia Mazayeva, because she really invested a lot in the preparation of the work. She provided extensive consultations as for medical issues, and I would like also to thank my family for their tolerance while I was preparing my thesis, and thank you very much to everyone present here. Thank you, everyone. So, dear friends, thus I close our today's panel session. I would like to thank everyone for the participation, and please turn off the broadcasting.